I flipped the switch at 3:17 a.m., and the sound of that water draining out of their perfect little paradise was the most honest thing I'd heard in months. The low hum of the pump cut through the night air, steady and mechanical, like it had been waiting its whole life for this exact moment, and I just stood there in the dark, boots pressed into damp Texas soil, watching the surface of that crystal blue pool start to ripple, then sink, then slowly disappear into something it was never supposed to be. You could still smell the chlorine from 50 yards out, sharp and artificial, mixing with the real scent of earth and cattle behind me, and that contrast right there pretty much summed up the whole mess. My name's Ethan Caldwell, and that land, every inch of those 120 acres stretching past that fence line, has been in my family since 1952, long before anyone ever thought about building matching mailboxes and calling it a community. My grandfather ran cattle on that same patch of ground. My father fixed fences under that same brutal summer sun. And me, I learned early how to read the land like it was a blueprint. Every slope, every drainage line, every inch of soil that either held water or gave it up. So when I came back from a 2-week cattle auction up in Oklahoma and saw a line of white deck chairs sitting where my grazing field used to be, I knew something was wrong before I even killed the engine. The gravel crunched different under my tires, like it didn't belong there anymore. And when I stepped out, that smell hit me first. Chlorine, sunscreen, fresh concrete baking under a Texas sun. And I just stood there, staring at a full-blown community pool sitting dead center on my land like it had always been there. Kids laughing, water splashing, someone grilling burgers off to the side like it was a holiday weekend. And right at the entrance, bolted into a slab of polished stone, a sign that read Whitmore Estates Community Pool. Not a question, not a mistake, a statement. That's when she walked up, Margaret Whitmore herself, sunglasses on. That smile she wore like it was part of the uniform, the kind that looks polite until you realize it never reaches the eyes. She didn't ask who I was. Didn't need to. Just looked me up and down, boots, dust, truck parked behind me, and said, "You must be the previous owner of this parcel. We've really elevated the value of this area." Previous owner. I could feel the heat rising off the concrete, feel the tension sitting in my jaw, but I didn't say a word. Because right then, standing there with the sound of splashing water echoing across land that had never seen anything but cattle and rain, I realized something she didn't. They thought they built something permanent, something untouchable, but they built it on land they didn't understand. And around here, water doesn't belong to whoever fills it. It belongs to whoever controls where it goes. The next morning, the sun came up slow and heavy, casting that dull orange glow across the water like it was trying to make the whole thing look natural, like it belonged there, but it did not fool me for a second. I stood at the fence line with a cup of black coffee going cold in my hand, watching a group of homeowners already setting up lounge chairs, their voices carrying across the open field where my cattle used to graze, and every laugh echoed wrong, like it was bouncing off something that had no business existing in the first place. The concrete around that pool was still too clean, edges sharp, no cracks, no history, just a fresh scar cut into land that had taken 70 years to settle into itself. I walked the perimeter slow, boots pressing into soil that felt tighter than it used to, packed down by machinery that never asked permission, and every few steps I caught details that told a bigger story. Drainage lines rerouted, irrigation channels filled in, the original slope of the land forced flat, so water would sit exactly where they wanted it. That was their first mistake. They shaped the surface, but they never understood what was underneath. By the time I reached the shallow end, I could see the connection point clear as day. A PVC intake line running from the old irrigation system my grandfather installed back in 1978, patched into their filtration setup, like it had always been part of the plan, and I just stood there for a second, letting that sink in, because that single line told me everything I needed to know. They did. Not just build on my land. They tied themselves into it. Around noon, Maggie showed up again. Same sunglasses, same controlled smile. Clipboard in hand this time like she was running a job site instead of trespassing on private property. And she started talking before I even got close, explaining permits, zoning adjustments, something about community enhancement and underutilized acreage. Words stacked on top of each other like they could bury the truth if she used enough of them. I let her talk. I watched the way she gestured toward the pool, the way she never once looked at the ground beneath her feet, And when she finally paused, expecting some kind of reaction, I just asked one question, calm and steady. Who approved tying into that irrigation line? For a split second, her smile tightened, just enough to notice if you were paying attention, and then it came right back, smooth as ever. All utilities were handled by our contractors in accordance with county guidelines. That was not an answer. That was a dodge. And right then, standing there with the heat rising off the concrete and the faint smell of chlorine mixing with dust, I realized she did not know what that line actually was. She saw a pipe. I saw a system. That irrigation network was not just plumbing. It controlled how water moved across every acre of this land, where it collected, where it drained, how it fed the soil and the livestock, and more importantly, who had the legal right to operate it. My grandfather built it with state oversight. My father maintained it through drought years that nearly wiped out half the county. And me, I knew every valve, every junction, every weak point like it was burned into memory. They thought they had added value. What they really did was plug their entire showpiece into something they did not own, did not understand, and definitely could not control. I took one last look at the water, calm on the surface, reflecting a sky that did not care about any of this. And then I turned back toward the house, already running through the layout in my head, every connection, every control point, every step it would take to remind them exactly whose land they were standing on. By late afternoon, the heat settled in heavy, pressing down on everything like it always does. In central Texas, and that pool shimmered under the sun like it was proud of itself, like it had earned the right to be there. And the more I looked at it, the more I noticed how out of place it really was. The edges were too straight, the water too still, no movement except what they forced into it with pumps and filters, nothing like the natural flow this land was built on. I walked back toward the equipment shed about 200 yards from the house, the same one my father used to store spare piping and valve tools, and the air inside hit me with that familiar mix of rust, dust, and old motor oil, a smell that always meant things were built to last, not just to look good. I ran my hand along the main control panel mounted against the far wall, metal worn smooth from years of use, and I could almost hear my father's voice explaining it again, slow and patient, how every section of the ranch connected through this system, how water never just sat still out here. It moved. It obeyed whoever understood it. I flipped open the panel, exposing the network of valves and gauges, each one labeled in faded marker, creek feed, south pasture, overflow line, drainage channel, and right there, clear as day, the junction that now fed into their pool. They had not removed the original system. They had built around it, patched into it, assuming it was just another utility line they could tap without consequence. That was their second mistake. I crouched down, studying the pressure readings, watching the needle flick slightly as the pool's filtration system cycled, and for the first time since I got back, I felt something settle into place. This was not chaos. This was structure. This was control, and it was still mine. That evening, I drove into town, tires humming against the highway, and stopped by the county records office just before closing. The place smelled like paper and air conditioning, quiet in a way that felt almost sacred compared to the noise back at the ranch, and I requested the original deed files, not the copies, not the summaries, the real documents. The clerk barely looked up as she handed over a thick folder, edges worn, pages yellowed with time, and I flipped through them right there at the counter, scanning for one thing I already knew existed but needed to see in black and white. It did not take long. There it was, dated 1978, water management rights tied directly to the Caldwell property, including full operational control over any structures connected to the irrigation network. Not partial, not shared, full control. I read that line twice, letting every word lock into place, and then I closed the folder slowly, the sound of paper sliding against paper louder than it should have been in that quiet room. When I stepped back outside, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and I just stood there for a second, breathing in warm evening air that smelled nothing like chlorine, nothing like concrete, just dust and open land. They thought permits and paperwork gave them ownership. They thought building something big made it permanent. But all they really did was anchor themselves to a system they did not control, a system that answered to one name. And that name was still written on every original document that mattered. I got back in the truck, started the engine, and as the headlights cut through the fading light, I was no longer trying to figure out what they had done. I was planning exactly how it was going to end. The next few days, I did not argue, I did not raise my voice, and I definitely did not try to tear anything down, because people like Maggie expect noise, they expect confrontation, and they know exactly how to win when things get loud. But silence makes them comfortable, and comfortable people make mistakes. I kept my routine the same. Early mornings, checking fence lines, feeding cattle, moving slow and steady like nothing had changed, even when I could hear the distant echo of splashing water carrying across the pasture like a reminder that something had changed. Every afternoon, more cars showed up along that freshly paved edge, tires crunching where gravel used to be, families unloading coolers, kids running past signs that had no right to be there, and right in the middle of it all, Maggie walking around like she owned every inch of ground beneath her heels. She started sending letters by the third day, official-looking envelopes left in my mailbox, citing things like livestock odor interference and non-compliant land usage, words stacked together like they meant something more than they did, but I read every single line carefully, because buried inside those complaints was exactly what I needed, confirmation that they believed the land was already theirs. That belief was going to cost them. One afternoon, I took a slow walk along the outer fence, the sun beating down hard enough to make the air shimmer, and I noticed something else they had overlooked: runoff. The way water settled after heavy use, the slight pooling along the north edge where the ground dipped just enough to collect overflow, and I crouched down, pressed my hand into the soil, damp where it should have been dry, because that pool was not just sitting there, it was feeding into the land, following the same paths my irrigation system had used for decades. They thought they contained the water. They did not. It was already moving, already obeying the original design. That night, I went back to the control shed, the air cooler now, carrying the faint hum of insects and distant cattle shifting in the dark, and I started mapping it out in my head, every valve, every connection, every place where their system depended on mine without them even realizing it. I adjusted one gauge slightly, not enough to trigger anything obvious, just enough to test the response, and a few minutes later, I could hear the filtration system in the distance change pitch, a subtle shift, but clear to anyone who knew what to listen for. That was all the confirmation I needed. They were completely tied in. The following evening, Maggie approached me again, this time with two members of her board, both dressed like they were attending a meeting instead of standing in the middle of a working ranch, and she handed me another document, thicker this time, something about formal compliance and integration into the community plan. I took it, glanced at the first page, then folded it once and handed it right back. "You should have checked the water rights," I said, calm, even, nothing more. She blinked, just once, and for the first time, there was a crack in that perfect composure, small, almost invisible, but it was there. "All utilities were cleared," she replied, voice tighter now, less polished. I nodded, looking past her toward the pool where the evening lights had just come on, casting that artificial blue glow across land that had never needed it. "That is not how water works out here," I said, then turned and walked away before she could respond. Behind me, I could feel the shift, not in what they were doing, but in how certain they felt about it. And once that certainty starts to slip, everything built on top of it begins to follow. By the end of the week, the pattern was clear, not just in the way they used the pool, but in the way they thought about it, like it had always been part of their world, like it had erased everything that came before it, and that kind of thinking is dangerous, because it makes people careless. I could hear it in their conversations when I passed by, the way they talked about our pool and community property, the way they laughed about expanding the deck, maybe adding a second seating area, maybe even bringing in lighting for night events, all of it built on an assumption that no one was going to challenge them. Maggie leaned into that confidence, hosting a weekend gathering that pulled in half the subdivision. Folding tables set up along the concrete edge, music playing just loud enough to carry across the pasture, the smell of grilled food mixing with chlorine in a way that still did not belong on this land. I stayed back, leaning against the fence line, watching from a distance where the grass met the packed dirt, and I paid attention to the details, how often the filtration system cycled, how the water level adjusted when more people got in, how the overflow drained along that same northern dip I had traced days before. Every movement, every sound, It all fed back into the same system. That was the part they never saw. Late that evening, when the crowd thinned out and the lights reflected across the surface like something out of a magazine, I walked back to the control shed again, slower this time, more deliberate, the air thick and quiet except for the low hum of machinery in the distance. I opened the panel, ran my fingers across the valves, and this time I did not just observe. I adjusted. Just a quarter turn on the primary intake restriction, a slight shift in flow direction, nothing that would trigger alarms or sudden changes, just enough to begin redirecting how the system responded over time. Water is patient. It does not fight. It follows. And if you guide it right, it will do exactly what you want without anyone noticing until it is too late to stop it. Over the next 2 days, I watched the results unfold in small ways. The waterline dropping just a fraction faster after each use. The filtration system running longer cycles to compensate. The faint change in sound that only someone familiar with the system would catch. To them, it was nothing. To me, it was confirmation. They were completely dependent on a system they did not control. Maggie tried once more to assert authority, stopping me near the driveway with that same clipboard, pointing out new violations, something about unauthorized agricultural activity near a recreational zone. But her voice lacked the same certainty it had before, like something underneath her confidence had started to shift. I listened, nodded once, and let her finish, then glanced past her toward the pool, where a couple of homeowners were already setting up for another afternoon, chairs scraping lightly against concrete, laughter drifting across land that did not belong to them. You should enjoy it while you can, I said, calm, almost casual, and for a moment she just stared at me, trying to read something in my face that I was not giving her. Then I walked past, boots steady on ground that had never once questioned who owned it. Because at that point, it was no longer about proving anything. It was about timing. And timing, just like water, is everything. The morning of the next Saturday started quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like something is about to happen, the air thick and still before the heat fully settles in. And I was already up before sunrise, standing inside that control shed with my hand resting on the main valve, feeling the faint vibration of water moving through the system like a pulse beneath the metal. Outside, the land stretched out the way it always had, open, steady, unchanged, and for a moment it almost felt like none of this had happened, like the past week had been some kind of mistake that would correct itself if I just waited long enough. But then I heard it, the distant rumble of early arrivals, car doors shutting, voices carrying across the pasture, and I knew exactly what they were planning. Maggie had sent out notices all week, building up to this, a summer kickoff event, her words, not mine, and by mid-morning that pool was going to be packed with people who believed they were celebrating something permanent. I stepped outside, the smell of dust and dry grass grounding me in something real, and walked the perimeter one more time, checking every line, every connection point, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. The slight adjustment I had made days ago had already done its work. The system was primed, pressure balanced in a way that looked normal on the surface but leaned entirely in my favor underneath. Around 10 o'clock, the music started, low at first, then building, laughter layered over it, the sound of splashing water carrying farther than it should have, like it was trying to claim more space than it deserved. I stayed out of sight, positioned just far enough back near the shed where I could hear everything but remain invisible, and I waited. Because timing matters more than action, and action without the right moment is just noise. By noon, the place was full, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, someone cheering as they jumped into the water, the kind of energy that comes from people who think they are completely in control of their environment. That was the moment. I stepped back inside, the temperature dropping slightly as the shade took over, and I looked at the panel one last time, every valve labeled, every gauge steady, the entire system sitting there like it had been waiting for permission. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I turned the main control slowly, just enough to redirect the flow entirely, cutting off intake from the feed line and opening the drainage path that had always existed beneath their construction. At first, nothing dramatic happened, just a subtle shift in pressure, a faint change in the hum of the system, something no one out there would notice over the music and conversation. But then, minute by minute, the process began. Water does not argue. It follows gravity. And once it starts moving in a different direction, it does not stop until it gets where it is going. I stepped back outside, closing the shed door behind me, and walked toward the fence line again, boots steady, eyes fixed on that pool in the distance, watching as the surface that had been so still began to change, just slightly, just enough to signal that something underneath was no longer the same. And out there, surrounded by noise and certainty, they had no idea that everything they were standing in the middle of was already slipping away. At first, it was just a ripple, the kind you would miss if you were not looking for it, a slight shift in the surface that caught the sunlight differently. Like the water had blinked for a second and no one noticed, but I saw it from the fence line, clear as anything, because I knew exactly what was happening underneath. The music kept playing, voices overlapping, someone laughing too loud near the deep end, and Maggie stood near the center with a drink in her hand, talking like she was hosting something permanent, something she believed could not be touched. Then the waterline dropped, not much, maybe half an inch at first, just enough for the tile edge to show where it had been hidden before, and one of the homeowners pointed it out like it was a trick of the light. They leaned over, squinting, brushing it off with a shrug, because people do not question comfort until it disappears completely. Another few minutes passed, and the change became harder to ignore, the skimmer vents starting to pull in air with a faint slurping sound that did not match the steady rhythm from before, and that is when the first bit of confusion started to ripple through the crowd. Conversations paused, heads turned, someone stepped out of the pool and looked down at the surface like it had betrayed them. I stayed exactly where I was, boots planted in dirt that had not moved in decades, watching as the system did what it had always been designed to do. The water kept dropping, slow but undeniable now, exposing more of the concrete walls, the bright blue turning into a dull, uneven line as gravity took over and redirected everything back into the land it came from. Maggie noticed next. You could see it in the way she stopped mid-sentence, her expression tightening just slightly as she looked down, then around, trying to process something that did not fit her understanding of control. She snapped her fingers towards someone near the equipment housing, probably one of the contractors she had relied on, and they rushed over, lifting the panel, checking switches, flipping things that had no authority over the system they were tied into. The music cut off not long after that, replaced by the low hum of confusion, questions rising, voices losing that easy confidence they had earlier in the day. The waterline dropped another inch, then another, and now there was no pretending it was normal. The shallow and starting to show patches of wet concrete where water had already pulled away, the reflection of the sky breaking apart into uneven fragments. I could smell it from where I stood, the chlorine fading, replaced by something more natural, damp earth pushing through as the artificial layer peeled back. People began stepping out, towels wrapped tighter, eyes scanning for answers that were not coming, and Maggie, for the first time since I met her, looked uncertain, not loud, not commanding, just standing there with that clipboard still in her hand, like it could fix something it never controlled. And through all of it, I did not move, because this was not chaos. This was correction, the land taking back what it never agreed to give, 1 inch of water at a time. By the time the water dropped below the halfway mark, there was no hiding it anymore, no explanation that could smooth it over, just a growing silence spreading across the concrete, like something had shifted that no one could fix with a clipboard or a phone call. The bright blue surface that had looked so perfect that morning was now broken, uneven, exposing long streaks of pale concrete underneath, and the smell had changed completely. The sharp chlorine fading into something heavier, something closer to wet soil and exposed ground. People stood around the edges now instead of inside it, arms crossed, towels draped over shoulders, voices lowered into questions that no one seemed able to answer. Maggie moved faster this time, heels clicking against the concrete as she paced toward the equipment panel again, gesturing sharply, her voice tighter, less polished, trying to pull control back into her hands through volume alone. But the system did not respond to her voice. It responded to physics, and physics had already made its decision. I watched as one of her contractors crouched by the panel, opening it, flipping switches, checking readings that no longer meant anything without control of the main line, and I could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way he hesitated before saying anything, because he knew something she did not. This was not a malfunction. This was design. The waterline dropped again, another inch, then another, and now the shallow end was almost completely exposed, the smooth surface replaced by damp concrete that darkened in irregular patterns as the last thin layer of water pulled away. A few people started gathering their things, folding chairs with quick, sharp movements, coolers snapping shut, conversations turning from confusion to frustration, but still no one knew where to direct it. Maggie finally looked past the pool, past the people, and her eyes landed on me standing at the fence line, steady, unmoving, and for a second everything else seemed to fade out, like the entire scene narrowed down to that one line of sight between us. She started walking, faster now, crossing the space with purpose, her expression no longer controlled but sharpened, focused, like she was finally ready to confront what she had been ignoring all week. "What did you do?" she called out before she even reached me, her voice cutting through the low noise around us. But I did not answer right away. I let the moment sit, let the sound of water continuing to drain fill the space between us, that steady, quiet pull that did not need permission. When she got close enough, I could see it clearly now, not just frustration, but realization starting to form underneath it, the first understanding that something fundamental had been overlooked. I glanced past her shoulder toward the pool, now more concrete than water, and then back at her. "I did not do anything," I said, calm, even, the same tone I had used from the beginning. "I just let it do what it was always designed to do." She opened her mouth like she was about to argue, to push back, but the words did not come out the same way this time, because behind her, the last section of water near the deep end shifted again, pulling away from the wall, exposing more of the structure she thought she owned. And in that moment, standing there with the artificial stripped away piece by piece, it was no longer her project, no longer her authority, just exposed concrete sitting on land that had never stopped belonging to me. By late afternoon, there was nothing left to argue about, no surface left to pretend on, just an empty concrete shell sitting in the middle of land that had finally reasserted itself, the last thin streams of water slipping away into channels that had been there long before anyone thought about turning this place into something it was not. The air smelled different now, heavier, real, the faint trace of chlorine completely gone, replaced by damp earth and sun-warmed dust, and the silence that settled over the crowd was not confusion anymore. It was acceptance, the kind that comes when something undeniable happens right in front of you. People started leaving in waves, chairs folded, coolers loaded, engines turning over one by one as tires pulled away from ground that never welcomed them in the first place. And with every car that disappeared down that paved edge, the noise faded back into something familiar, something that belonged to this land. Maggie stayed longer than the rest, standing near the edge of that drained structure, heels no longer clicking with the same confidence, her clipboard hanging loosely at her side like it had lost its purpose. She looked out over what used to be her centerpiece, her project, her statement, and for the first time, there was nothing left for her to claim. No authority, no control, just exposed concrete tied into a system she never owned. I walked past her without stopping, boots steady, the sound of gravel returning underfoot as I moved toward the far gate, and I could feel her eyes on me, searching for something to hold on to, some angle to rebuild from, but there was nothing left to negotiate. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, I was already back at the site, tools in hand, not to destroy anything, not to fight, but to repurpose what was left into something that actually belonged. The concrete basin was still solid, still functional, just no longer pretending to be anything it was not, and I adjusted the drainage flow again, this time slowing it, redirecting it so water would settle at a level that made sense for the land, not for appearances. By mid-morning, the first group of cattle approached the edge, cautious at first, then steady, hooves pressing against the concrete as they leaned in to drink, and the sound that replaced the echo of splashing water was quieter, deeper, the natural rhythm of something that fit. No music, no shouting, just the low, steady presence of life continuing the way it always had. A county inspector showed up later that afternoon, called in by someone who finally realized paperwork might matter after all, and he walked the site slowly, boots sinking slightly into damp ground, eyes moving from the exposed structure to the connection points, to the original irrigation lines that were still intact and clearly documented. He did not need much time. He did not need much explanation. When he looked at Maggie, who had returned with that same clipboard now clutched tighter than before. His tone was simple, direct, grounded in something she could not argue with. Unauthorized construction. Improper utility integration. Violation of land and water rights. Each word landed heavier than the last, not because they were loud, but because they were final. By the time he left, there was nothing left for her to stand on, no version of this where she came out in control. I stood there a moment longer, watching the cattle move in and out of that concrete basin like it had always been part of the ranch, like it had finally found its purpose. And then I turned back toward the house, the land stretching out in front of me the same way it always had, unchanged where it mattered. They thought they built something permanent. Turns out, they just built it on the wrong system. And out here, the system always wins.